You're listening to the Future Tech Podcast with Richard Jacobs. Future technologies such as artificial intelligence, stem cells, 3D printing, gene editing, Bitcoin, blockchain, the microbiome, quantum computing, virtual reality, and exploring space are much closer than you might think. In fact, many early versions of these technologies are in play right now, and the companies that are using these technologies are the focus of this podcast. My goal for you, the listener, is to learn from these podcasts. You may very well learn something that may change the course of your life for the better, steer you towards a new career, or give you insight into addressing a thorny medical problem. Remember, this podcast and its content is informational in nature only. No medical, tax, legal, financial, or psychological advice is being given. If you've enjoyed the podcast, please listen, subscribe, like, and tell your friends about it. Thank you. Hello, this is Richard Jacobs with the Future Tech Podcast. I have Ryan Rapp, Head of Product Discovery at Pairwise. The website is pairwise.com. We're going to be talking about the creation of new crops through various gene editing techniques. So, Ryan, thanks for coming.
Thanks for having me here today.
Yeah, so tell me about Pairwise. What's the premise of the company?
Yeah, so we're a pretty new company. We're just coming up on our 1-year anniversary, actually, on March 25th. And we're still here, so that's fantastic. But our real mission is to take the power of gene editing and bring it to the actual consumer, the produce aisle. What we're hoping to do is give the consumer a really positive experience with produce, some type of fruit or vegetable that they couldn't have had access to otherwise without the power of gene editing.
Okay, so what specific crops are you focusing on, and what's the goal, the metric?
Yeah, so right now we have two streams sort of going. One stream is really around a collaboration that we've entered into with Bayer Crop Science, and that is really focused on the row crops. And when we say row crops, what we really mean is cotton, corn, soybean, canola, wheat, those sorts of large-scale agriculture things. On the consumer side, right now we're exploring a bunch of different options with fruits and vegetables, things that the consumer might not have had access to before, or bringing them something in a way that makes eating healthy more convenient for them. We haven't finalized what our product concepts are right now. We're still doing a lot of technical work to help hammer that out in the laboratory. But one of the examples that we typically use is you can imagine something like a pitless cherry, right? So a lot of parents won't feed cherries to their children because they're obviously, and rightly so, concerned about them choking on that pit. Even for an adult, it's, not the socially most graceful food because you obviously have to spit out that pit in a public situation. But on the other hand, there's a lot of great qualities about cherries, right? Their flavor is wonderful. They're high in antioxidants. They're very healthy berry to be eating, or very healthy fruit to be eating. But they're really limited in the sense that they're only available for a short time of the year. And they are also, you got to spit that pit out.
You mentioned a few crops. Which crop is this again?
Cherries.
Cherries, okay.
Cherry, right?
Particular kind of cherries, but go ahead. Yeah, go ahead with the cherries.
Yeah. So any cherry that you can think of, like a Rainier or Bing or whatever. If you can imagine that without having a pit in it, you go from something that is sort of a complicated process to eat and you might steer away from it in certain situations to one that could be really, really easy. So if you think about what sort of drives people to make food selections in the grocery store, a lot of it is really around convenience. And I think there's a great story that is there with the baby carrots. So prior to the introduction of those little baby carrots, which are not in fact babies, right? They're really just, originally they were the waste product of the carrot manufacturing process. So those were the pieces that were broken off of the larger carrots and couldn't be used in the bag. And what they did was they came up with a way to basically roll those carrots around in basically a big concrete drum, right? And just shave them down to little bite-sized things that are the perfect delivery vehicle for ranch dressing. And they took those and they put them in a bag. They're washed, they're ready to eat, and it's extremely convenient. And it drove up the consumption of carrots by several times what it had been prior to there being baby carrots out there. And that's an example of how convenience can really have an impact on the way people make decisions with what they're eating. And so if you think of something
what about the food waste problem? A lot of produce gets thrown away because it has blemishes or bruises or doesn't look perfectly ripe. Why not point the attention that way?
so that we can, stores will accept more produce and we won't throw so much stuff away?
Sure. Reducing food waste is always a good thing to be working towards. In a lot of those cases, those items that do have the bruises, the blemishes, the apples that have some sort of surface defect, they already wind up in a cut food. And so they wind up being cut and prepared and packaged up in a way that the consumer can get them, that sometimes goes towards them. But it really doesn't drive at a cost point, the consumer selecting those all the time. So if you look at those prepared foods, they're typically quite expensive. The other place that those sort of blemished foods typically go is into something that would be very, very processed, something that was cut up into small pieces and used in a canned product or in a frozen product or in a jam if it was a berry or an apple or something like that. But that would be one other way to do it. But gene editing gives us the ability to think about how you could have that done on a large scale and get people eating healthier and making better choices in the grocery aisle because that fruit is actually convenient.
What about gene editing so that the fruit or the edible part of a plant doesn't pick up pesticides like glyphosate, and other things like that? Because that, we're told to wash certain fruits, for instance, because they're likely to contain pesticide residues on them or in them. So why not engineer, fruits so that they reject that, and then we have healthier produce as well?
Yeah, you should always wash your fruit. That's a good piece of advice. Anything fresh that you eat like that. I think the route to go there would be trying to engineer the plants so that they were actually resistant to the pests in the first place, and so that you wouldn't need to actually spray them with the pesticides at all. And the plants could take care of the insect or the pathogen on their own. And that's a really complicated piece of science. There's a lot of universities, a lot of private companies working on that out there. And it is a possibility that is enabled by gene editing, that we can tap into all this natural genetic diversity that's out there and then begin to collect it together in the right way, putting it together in the right packages so that we can have these plants that have required inputs like pesticides and herbicides.
I mean, I would think that a lot of, plants and things we eat have already been engineered or at least selectively bred to be sweeter and sweeter and sweeter. And, now I guess you want to take it down a path of easier to eat. Is that how you'd sum it up, or is it something different?
It's easy to eat, but it's also that nutrition component. You want to give people that variety of things that are healthy for them and easy to consume. And you're exactly right. That's what over the last, several thousand years of human history, humans have been selecting on different plant species for lots of different things. One is primarily yield, making the plants produce more. Another one is the ability to just grow the way that we want to grow them as opposed to the way that they grow in the wild, and whether that's changing the shape or the architecture of the plant, making them flower at different times, selecting those mutants that were naturally occurring in the wild that did those things. And then that last one is obviously the taste and the flavor profile in the fruit. We've selected for fruits and vegetables to be bigger over time, generally versus their wild counterparts. We really do like the color that comes with them all, and we do like the taste of the sweetness that goes with it. A lot of breeding programs over the past they're complicated to run, and you can't select on everything at once. And so in some instances, those different aspects have been lost, whether it be a little bit of the taste was lost during the breeding process or a little bit of disease resistance. Gene editing gives us the ability to do two things that I think are pretty unique. So one is really say, let's look at what we have today and think about how we want to make those better. And instead of going through a process of perhaps breeding that plant for 20 or 50 years, we can do that much, much quicker with gene editing by reintroducing some of that genetic diversity that's been lost. The other place that's really cool is we can begin to explore different crop species that haven't been sort of part of the mainstream of food production. And usually that's because either there's something that prohibits them from coming into the agricultural system, like the restricted way that they grow, or they don't produce enough when they do grow. And we can begin to think about doing what some people are calling molecular domestication, which is really bringing in everything we know about what makes a plant a good food source for a human and to grow well in an agronomic system. We can apply that knowledge through gene editing to bring that plant into the human food production system. I think this is pretty cool because it can even work for things that are sort of marginal or that we're just eating in a part of the world. It can give us a chance to grow in other places.
Well, there's also the time factor. Like I've read that asparagus takes 3 years to get, and a lot of fruit trees will take 3 to 5 years to mature before they bear fruit. And I haven't found an answer as to why that happens or what the mechanism is. So if you were able to somehow shorten that mechanism to, to tell a bush or a tree, hey, it's time to put out fruit in the first year, that could dramatically affect the availability of certain, certain fruits or certain items.
Yeah, that's exactly right. The asparagus is a great example of that. You grow this plant, you grow it. You have a 1-year crown, you have a 2nd-year crown. Usually that 2nd year you can do a light harvest, but in that 3rd year is when the plant's really productive. Same thing is true for apple trees. They're slow growing trees, and the trees don't flower usually until they're about 5 years old. To give you an example, that new cosmic crisp apple that Washington State has talked so much about, and they've planted, I think, about 10 million trees dedicated to bringing this new variety to market next year. That plant was they made the cross that produced that plant back in the late 90s. And here we are almost 25 years later, and we're just coming to the fruition and seeing it being offered to the consumer for the first time. So we are really trying to apply our knowledge about molecular genetics and how genes function to take some of those things out as well with gene editing. And that's when we start to think about, how does it grow in a production system? To your point about the flowering, the last several years have been pretty exciting for that whole space. There's been a whole suite of work. There was a search that went on for my entire adult life and long before that, with people looking for a compound called florigen, which was supposed to help trees and all plants in general be responsible for flowering. And it was supposed to behave like a hormone and like the other plant hormones that you hear about, like ethylene that helps fruit ripen, or abscisic acid and gibberellic acid that help plants grow and develop. And they had a really difficult time finding it. But what it turns out is that they now know the genes that are involved in this. And if you ever look around at the loci called FT, which is the flowering time locus, and TFL, which is a repressor of that, there's been a huge amount of work that has exploded over the last 7 or 8 years, really looking at how all of these things interact and how they integrate environmental signals to help make the determination about when it's right to go from being a juvenile plant to being a sexually mature plant and enter reproduction.
Yeah, and then within the time period where they are mature, how do you get them to fruit maybe twice a year instead of once, or in a different season than to which they're accustomed?
Yeah, that is again a great example. I think we can learn a lot by starting to harness the power of the natural diversity that's already out there. So there are some pretty cool cases where we've taken through the breeding process and selected these natural mutants and made that happen. So a great example of that is blueberries. Blueberries, when I was a kid, were these things that you had for a very limited time of the year, and they were even pretty regional within the U.S. And now you can go anywhere, any hotel, breakfast bar where they've got some yogurt, chances are that they've got some blueberries. They're in the salads at Starbucks, and you can get them 365 days a year no matter where you are. That was accomplished by creating plants that actually could grow and flower in the south of the U.S. and in different regions, so that there's a continual supply that's now available across North America and South America. Same thing as strawberries. When you talk about the June-bearing and ever-bearing, those ever-bearing strawberries have a mutation in that TFL locus that actually allows them to keep on developing flowers throughout the summer. And as we learn more and more about that, we can think more and more about from a design perspective, how we want to bring in the different components of those systems into those plants that we do want to eat.
So what's driving which crops or plants will be worked on and engineered and manipulated?
Yeah, the economics is obviously a huge driver of that. So people are trying to understand, us included, where the value is in the gene editing proposition. And a lot of the different companies that are out there are taking different strategies. There's people working both in the consumer space, but also in this row crop space that I mentioned earlier. So a lot of companies are focusing on things like oil profiles and trying to figure out how to bring healthier oils to the market. Companies like us are focusing on more nutritious produce and figuring out how to get nutritious produce into the hands of the consumer. But it's really about that value proposition and believing that you can create something that is really going to have a positive impact on people's lives.
Okay. So again, what are the major products or or plants that you're working on? Is it cherries, or is that just an example?
Yeah, that's just an example. Right now
Okay.
we're still in that early exploratory phase. So whenever you go in and you look at working on one of these plants, chances are it is that not a ton of work has been done on the plants in the laboratories before. And so there's a period that you have to go through. You have to take that plant, you have to learn how to cultivate it in the settings you've got available to you, and the ones you have it cultivated, you have to learn how to help that plant sort of make the transition to the laboratory. And what I mean about that is there's a whole bunch of tools that you have to use in this process, the gene editing tools, and the biology of all these organisms is different. And so what you have to do is figure out and test the tools and figure out how to get them to work in these. And then once they work, you can go ahead and do that. But lots of times you run into showstoppers that can't necessarily be overcome or would require more work to overcome than you think would be possible or feasible or economically viable. And so right now we're going through and learning what we can about the performance of the tools and figuring out how we can make the best tools go forward in some of these unique species.
So, have you identified what you want to work on? Are there any, big bad problems out there that you want to tackle first, or, is that proprietary?
Yeah, so what we're focusing on is really trying to nail it down to ones where, maybe there's a product there that's in the supermarket aisle today that is an okay food, but it has a few really big hangups, and some of those hangups could be around it could be around the taste, it could be around the convenience of the way that you eat it, it could be around its production system, and what we'd like to do is bring really spectacular options back to the consumer from those. We haven't nailed down the exact ones that we're working on yet. We're really evaluating about 3 or 4 right now.
Okay. Is there any out there that are, that everyone's kind of looking at and looking to tackle? Are there certain, items of produce that it seems, like lately, like apples have made an explosion in stores, and there's 8 million kinds of apples. So perhaps that's what's been worked on recently. I don't know.
Yeah, I'm not aware of any gene editing in apples. The apple has undergone this explosion of varieties. The flavor, sort of everyone's excited about the flavor coming back versus the red delicious that used to be there. That apple's finally been replaced by all these other things. The places that the consumer will probably see first, the ones that have gone through the regulatory process, is actually that non-browning mushroom. So they've created a mushroom, I can't remember the name of the company, they've created a mushroom that it's a white button mushroom that doesn't brown, and so it can be cut and prepared and go into a salad and still maintain that nice color without having the browning. The only other big one that's out there is actually so far is in field corn, and that was a modification of the starch profile in corn, but that's not directly for the consumer. That's more of a commodity type trait one. In the next couple of years, however, we'll start to see probably a lot more products coming through the USDA's deregulation process and exemption process that will be targeted toward the consumer. But we're not quite there yet. The technology has really been lagging behind in plants. There's been a lot of focus in the human space and getting it to work for human therapeutics. And the companies now that are affiliated and working on agriculture are really diving in at this point and trying to get those tools going.
Okay. Well, very good. So what's going to be happening in the next year or two with your work? What's some of your milestones?
Yeah, so some of our big milestones are getting proof of concept data in these different plants that we're pursuing. So as we go through and evaluating them, we'll be looking to see if we can create the edits, and we're excited to actually be able to see some of the phenotypes. And so we'll have new plants that we'll be looking at in the greenhouse. Some of the other milestones that we have are really, since we are running the 2 tracks of also working on this collaboration with Bayer Crop Sciences, really delivering value to them and hoping that we can bring new traits into their row crop business that help with things like disease resistance, performance under drought, nitrogen stress, those sorts of things, protecting yield when there's some sort of environmental or biological stress being applied. But the big ones for us are really, again, on the consumer side and getting the proof of concept material out there so we can understand where we think that there's a pathway to commercial development.
Okay. Well, very good. So what's the best way for people to find out more about Pairwise?
Yeah, so the best way for people to find out more is you can look at our website, which is just www.pairwise.com, or you're more than welcome to connect with me on LinkedIn.
All right. Well, very good. Well, I appreciate you coming on the podcast.
Yeah, thank you so much for the opportunity. It was great talking to you.
You're listening to the Future Tech Podcast with Richard Jacobs. Future technologies such as artificial intelligence, stem cells, 3D printing, gene editing, Bitcoin, blockchain, the microbiome, quantum computing, virtual reality, and exploring space are much closer than you might think. In fact, many early versions of these technologies are in play right now, and the companies that are using these technologies are the focus of this podcast. My goal for you, the listener, is to learn from these podcasts. You may very well learn something that may change the course of your life for the better, steer you towards a new career, or give you insight into addressing a thorny medical problem. Remember, this podcast and its content is informational in nature only. No medical, tax, legal, financial, or psychological advice is being given. If you've enjoyed the podcast, please listen, subscribe, like, and tell your friends about it. Thank you.